Hello, and welcome to your CNET 204 Week 8 lecture video. This week we're going to look at images and tables, which seem like two completely unrelated things, but the lab is going to incorporate both. It's going to tie them together. So we're going to look at how to insert images into a web page, or link them, might be a more correct way of looking at it. How you can stylize images with CSS by floating them, and you can make them responsive as well. Just like we made our navigation bar resize based on the size of the device, you can do that with images too, which is actually a pretty cool thing. And we're going to look at tables, how to insert them and what makes up a table. We've got rows and the table header and the table data cells that are separate. And then we're going to look at stylizing them with CSS. So first up, images. To insert or embed images into a web page, you use the IMG tag. They're not technically inserted, but they're linked to that place of in the page instead. The path for the image can be either an absolute or relative URL. You should use relative URLs for an internally hosted image, and this makes your content easier to migrate between different environments, such as a production and a development environment, which, like exactly the same things that we talked about when we looked at hyperlinks and linking internally, right? Same concepts apply here to images. Now, two of the most commonly used attributes to the image tag are source, which it actually won't work without this. SRC stands for source, and it contains a relative or absolute path to the image. And then alt is used to display text if the image can't be loaded, which is a pretty awesome thing. We're going to implement the source attribute in this week's lab. We're not going to do anything with the alt attribute, but when we look at assignment 1 next week, we're going to look at the WAI standard. And that's one of the easy things you can implement from the WAI standard, so I intentionally left it out. Just a hint for your assignment 1. Here's the sample code that will insert or embed the image me.jpg, which is located in the images subdirectory. So image src in double quotes images / me.jpg. Now if this image is not where you claim it is, if the path is slightly different, or if it's not spelled correctly, you don't have the file extension correct, there's all kinds of things that can go on here that can go wrong. It just won't work. It's just not going to show up because HTML doesn't know where to go to look for the file. It looks in that path. If it's not there, it's going to load nothing. Those are some of the common issues students tend to have when they're learning how to insert images. Now to stylize images, there's a whole bunch of things you can do with CSS, but two of the most useful and most common things you can do are float them and make them responsive to resize based on the device. Floating an image changes its position relative to another object or another tag, such as a paragraph tag containing text. The sample code here will float the image to the left of whatever it's beside. So we issue in CSS we have our selector, right, the image tag, which you could use with a class or an ID. We looked at that last week, I want to say. And then float left. That'll float it left. Responsive images will adjust to fit the size of the screen for the device that they're being viewed on, which I've mentioned this a few times, right? It's important. Once upon a time, you used to be able to just develop for a desktop and mobile was an afterthought. Now, if you're not developing with mobile browsing in mind, you're doing it wrong. So we want to incorporate responsive design with everything, right? Everything you can. You could resize the images using CSS without needing any other program. It's a really handy thing, like Photoshop, right? You could resize it manually with Photoshop, but you could just do it with CSS and leave it the original size and resolution. You can actually use this technique, or not this exact technique I'm showing you, but you can create like a thumbnail gallery with CSS, and when you click on it, it'll open the full thing. It's kind of cool. The code I've provided here will make the image responsive, and this applies to every single image on the website. So it's really easy. IMGs, or image tag, max width 100%, and height auto. So when you're resizing an image, the best way to do it is to pick either the height or the width to resize, and then set the other attribute to auto, and that will allow the image to maintain its aspect ratio. Now, max width does a pretty cool thing, because it'll make sure that the maximum width of the image isn't bigger than the browser window itself. So it makes it scale it down, but still probably a bit bigger than it is on a desktop display for your mobile site, which might be desirable. It's a great thing. So next up we have tables. Tables are useful for displaying data in a tabular format, right? In rows and columns. This could be handy for displaying something like a schedule, which is what we're going to do. We're going to do our timetable this week. It could be useful for displaying trying to think of another example where you would use a table. Maybe conversion rates or different tax rates, if you were displaying that sort of information in a page. There's all kinds of things you can use them for. You should never use a table for your layout on your website. That's what people used to do in the 90s, and that's why if you look at any website from the 90s, it looks very boxy, because that's what they did. Don't ever do that. Tables open and close with the table tag, and they contain the following, at minimum anyway. There's more tags you can add, but at minimum the following tags. TR, which stands for table row, and that's used to define a row. TH, which stands for table headings, and it's used to define a table heading. You usually only do this in the first row. You've got all your headings for your table. Like, think about how tables are formatted normally, right? Outside of HTML. And then table cells are represented with the TD tag. This defines each cell that's not a heading in the table. And you need one of these even if there's no content there, because it helps keep everything positioned. Now, tables can be a bit tricky to learn, because the code for each row is written sequentially top to bottom in the order that it's displayed, left to right. So it gets a bit tricky, but it's not horrible. It's not horrible. You just got to play with it. Like everything else, right? Practice. Practice makes perfect. Here's a sample that will display the sample table. Oh, I forgot to take that out. It says depicted on the next slide. I'll fix that after I record this. It's depicted at the bottom of this slide. So we've got our table. I've indented everything once. And we've got operating systems and whether it's open or closed source. I called that source. I probably could have used a better heading, but it was just a simple example. So our first row here, right, table row, that's our headings in the sequence that they're going to be displayed left and right. So we've got operating system, that's our first column, and source, that's our second column. And then we close our row. We open a new row, so this is the second row here. And we have Linux, which is going to show up under operating system, and open source, because it's an open source operating system, that's going to show up under source. Now we close our row. We do the same thing for a new row, and we have Windows, which is closed source and closes the table. Hopefully that helps a bit. And you just kind of got to play with them. It's the way you learn. Now, a common thing you can want to stylize with CSS, there's lots of things you can do, is the border. And there's a couple different ways of doing this. There's short and longhand. The longhand method specifies the border's width, style, and color individually. So we've got this is going to apply to our table heading and table data cells, right? Border width, 0.25 EM, that's a responsive unit, that's a good thing to use. Border style, solid. Border color, that's black and hexadecimal, right? The shorthand might be a little more handy though. You can specify all of these on one line with a single parameter. But to do this, they have to appear in a certain order. Width, style, and color specifically. So THTD, it's going to apply to those two tags again. We just use the border attribute this time instead of having them each individually, and we list them out separated by a single space with a semicolon at the end. This will have the exact same effect, and it's a lot less code, but it's a little more complicated. It's not a lot more complicated, right? It's a good thing to learn. I'm not trying to discourage you. Learn the bit more complicated method because it's not that much more complicated. It's a good thing. Now sometimes you're going to want to center elements on the page too, just to provide a desired effect, to make it look nicer. You can accomplish this a few different ways, but the easiest way is to set the left and right margin to auto. This code here will center a table. So this applies to our table tag, margin left auto, margin right auto, and boom, it's centered. It's pretty great. So all of this stuff you're going to do in Lab 8. You're going to apply in Lab 8. You're going to create a new page. It's the first time we've created a new page since Lab 5, which seems insane. You're going to call it about.html. We're going to insert an image. We're going to use a table to format some text. You're going to resize your image with some CSS. You're going to apply some CSS to your table to make it look nice. And then you're going to, of course, push it to GitHub, pull it into your web server, all that fun stuff, and I'm going to show you that in the next video. Next week, you're going to work on Assignment 1. In Assignment 1, you're going to research the Web Accessibility Initiative, the WAI, that's what it's short for, or that's the acronym for it, I should say. And you're going to implement some of the accessibility features that are defined in it that we haven't already met as part of the labs in your website. And I intentionally left out a couple things in the labs that you can implement that are pretty easy. You're also going to register a domain name, which is great. We get a free domain name through GitHub Classroom, through the Student Developer Pack, which any student can register for. If you're watching this and you're not a Centennial College student, but you are a student at any educational institution, you can access this. So we're going to register a domain name, we're going to generate an SSL certificate, and you're going to configure the Apache web server with HTTPS. All of that is Assignment 1, and that's what we're going to look at next week. This week, well, let's get to creating about.html and sticking in an image in a table and formatting them. It's going to be awesome. Take care, be safe. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.